what we're considering in a good education is what we began with. If you recall, when we began in January, almost every Saturday, we asked the question, what are we doing? Not only why are we here, which is important, but more incisively, what are we doing? In other words, by being here for whatever reasons we might discover, whether rationalizations, justifications, actualizations, whatever, the more poignant question is, in coming here every Saturday, what are we doing? In other words, what does that amount to? Are we building something? And what we discovered was that if we just let it occur, if we just come each Saturday, the Saturdays occur in such a manner as to indicate to us intuitively that some sequence is being entered into. That we're not building anything in particular, but that by just doing it, by just coming each Saturday, and we began by talking about nature, and we specifically said that we don't have any identification for nature, which is a summation. We began with Thoreau's Walking, his little essay on walking, and we ourselves took walks. We also began with the I Ching, and discovered that Thoreau and the I Ching really do somehow come together. Not that Thoreau read the I Ching, he did not, and not that the I Ching has any footnotes to Thoreau, it does not. But that in the open-handed liberty of just letting occurrences happen, Thoreau and the I Ching are very affine. They occur together in a very similar way. The I Ching is all about change. I Ching. Change is a constant motion, which seems to be the case for nature. Nature is constantly happening. The late 20th century word for that, taken from early 20th century mathematics, is vectoring. That if anything can be said about nature, nature is somehow a collection of movements. Not just a collection of movements, which might presuppose some kind of selection, a collection by the principle of some selection, but something even larger, even less formal than collection. And again, because we were using mathematical terms like vectors, we use the mathematical term matrix. That nature seems to be a matrix of change, a matrix of vectors, which actually is very intelligent. It's extremely intelligent. Along about the time that Thoreau was writing, which turned out to be towards the end of his life, he brought out a week on the Concord and Merrimack River in 1,000-copy edition, and I think they sold 6 copies. The publisher made him take all the unsold copies back, and he took them up to the attic of the house where he lived with his sisters, and he said in one of his journal entries, I now have a library of over 1,000 books, 994 which I've written myself. And along about that time, there were some very interesting changes happening in mathematics. A man named William Hamilton, I don't think anyone ever called him Bill, who was writing about the same time that Thoreau was writing, changed forever the idea of space. William Hamilton, who died the same year Lincoln died, mathematically showed that it was quite conceivable that any point in space is not just a point, but is a collection of all of the vectors that are possible. And at that point is a matrix of all of the vectors going on. And this particular kind of space is called Hamiltonian space. In a way, Thoreau's Walking, his essay on walking, was like an insight into Hamiltonian space. Because while Thoreau was working on books, formal books like A Week on the Concord and Merrimack, which used to be thought that they were just nice little 19th century travel logs, just simple, nice little excursions of Victorian, American, New England, bachelor-type people who would carry little volumes of Shelley in their pocket and would sit out in nature and ooh and ah and were somehow transcendentalists or whatever that was. It turns out that that's not really the case, that that's very glib. That Thoreau revised A Week on the Concord and Merrimack again and again, and after about 9 or 10 years of revising, patiently learning how to write specifically, but the whole idea of a picturesque landscape is a deep philosophical issue. And Thoreau really paid attention to how can a human being really be in nature naturally. But that was a profound point with Thoreau, and his solution is one of the great universal classic solutions, qualifying him to be an American Upanishad. There's many sophisticated Gandhians of the 20th century who base themselves on Thoreau. They call him the sage of North America, revering him as if he were like the author of the Bhagavad Gita. Why? Because to be in nature naturally is very difficult to achieve when one is really conscious of what is involved. Because if space is not simply space, if a point is not just simply something there, but if space is like William Hamilton envisioned in his mathematics, it is potentially complex enough so that one could say, I will show you infinity in a grain of sand. And indeed, by the turn of the 19th century, as it was becoming 1900, a German mathematician named David Hilbert showed that not only was Hamilton's space interesting to investigate mathematically, but that it could be lifted to an even more accurate state. And that is that all of the little vectors that make up a point have combinations with each other, which also have to be taken into consideration. And this complex Hamiltonian space became Hilbert space. And Hilbert in his rigorous mathematics, so rigorous that later quantum mechanics is all based upon, the exfoliated potentials of Hilbert space. Not Euclidean space, not Newtonian space, not even Hamiltonian space, but Hilbert space. But when one takes a look at David Hilbert's writings, and one would have to have them in translation unless you read German, one notices that there is one non-interpretive element, one non-interpretive factor in a Hilbert point, and that is zero. The 0 point, the origin of all of the vectors, is not able to be factored into, though it is an integral of the matrix. And this is what we were talking about in terms of the I Ching. But the I Ching, which we paired with Thoreau for a very good reason, having worked on this kind of education for 30 years, it's not just by guess and by golly. These elements are in this particular sequence in order, but because they disclose, in a very mysterious way, an actuality which we are. And it's worth investigating to the extent that we can, of discovering who we are and where we are, and appreciating that we are exactly in the middle of a mystery which is profoundly interesting, to say the least. We saw that the I Ching, the Book of Changes, which is an ancient Chinese way of saying nature is a matrix of vectors, that the one indelible zero, the Tao, is not interpretable and yet always must be factored into a well-ordered sequence, and that the sequence is a phase, and each phase becomes the succeeding phase, and that these phases in the I Ching, it's a 5-phase energy cycle, beginning with Tao, which is a 0, which has no ascribable numerical value, and yet is the indispensable origin. The Tao somehow becomes 1. It somehow is then Te. When Tao moves, it is Te, and Te is 1. Or even stronger, oneness. More profoundly, it is unity. That 0, when 0 is dynamic, it becomes 1. This is a very big mystery. That it is so is incontrovertible. That it is so not only through 3,000-year-old Chinese esoteric philosophy, but late 20th century mathematics shows again and again, even using sophisticated Hilbert space in a quantum mechanical way, one can understand that somehow 0 becomes 1 when movement occurs. And one is tempted to ask then, as has been asked indeed many times, what is that movement? What's going on? One translation of the Tao Te Ching used, instead of the terms Tao and Te, they use the terms stillness and movement. That when there is movement, one has a yang, and when there is stillness, one has a yin. That somehow the receptivity of yin receives as stillness any movement, and that any movement always is paired with stillness. that yang and yin never occur isolate from each other. They are a pair. And Lao Tzu says that at the deepest of nature, pairing occurs. That if you go deeper than pairing, you somehow drop out of nature. And that while nature is a matrix of change, it's always going on, it's always scintillating, something's always cooking. It is always cooking because it is at the same time always still. There is no way to get around the fact, the empirical fact, the logical fact, the mathematical fact, the Taoist mystical fact that nature is occurring in zero and oneness at the very same time, paired always. It's a problem that was exacerbated in 1935 by a mathematician named Schrödinger, who wrote about a little cat, famous as Schrödinger's cat. That in a sealed container, you have a cat, and you have a little capsule of cyanide gas that can be activated, in which case the cat will be dead. If it's not activated, the cat will be alive. And you have a mirror which is half silvered, and it's positioned so that if anything reflects off the mirror, it will reflect down on the activator, breaking the cyanide capsule, and the cat will be dead. One single light particle, one single photon is introduced to this mirror, only one. As Sean Connery in The Hunt for Red October said, one ping only to verify our position. If you ping it just once, so that there's only one photon, the question is, will the cat be alive or dead? And mathematically, logically, mystically, the concurrence is exact. The alignment is perfect. That the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. Because the mirror is half silvered, the photon is split and one half of it goes through and the cat is alive. The other half reflects off the half silvered mirror, trickles the vial, and the cat is dead. The cat is both alive and dead. And there's no way, I repeat, no way, logically, mathematically, empirically, mystically, to not know that both scenarios happen paired at the same time, in the same way, for the same reality. The cat is both alive and dead. Now the cab driver waiting outside to take the physicists back to their condos says, open the container and let's find out. And if you open the container, the cat will either be alive or dead, but not both. What happens is that the vector state collapses and only one half of the reality remains. The cat is either alive or dead. This destructive devaluation of reality is exactly the disease that human beings are suffering from in our time. 1994. It's an epidemic. We're constantly being diced up into logically frayed moments that we are forced to accept as real, which is a bastardization of what is really real. And part of what this education is about is to reconnect us with the real, so that the mystery of life is there in all of its fullness. And the possibilities, the probabilities, the actualities of whatever we do are full. And that we are not hampered by such profound hangnails as whether we're alive or dead for real ever. That either of those issues are collapsed vector states that have nothing to do with what is real. And that on this level, something like psychoanalysis is a complete waste of time, in that your chances of being cured of whatever you think is wrong with you are exactly 50-50. The phrase used to be 6 of one, half a dozen of another. Which is the same way of saying there's no effect. Which is the same way of understanding that what is real because it is both zero-based and has unity at the same time, that they're paired. Look, there would be no computer programs of any kind if there were not a binary language of 0 and 1, which was discursively able to be developed indefinitely. Were 0 and 1 as a binary pair of expressivity not infinitely refinable, you would not be able to have a single microchip operate on any level, Pentium or not. What does all this mean? All this is tied with a bow, related directly to how every Saturday when we came, we asked, what are we doing? And we noticed, not because someone said it, or because the ideation was formed, but because we lived it, we experienced it, that every week that we were here, and we kept asking the question, we noticed that there were qualities that came together. Not that they came together, but that they occurred in pairedness. One is that there was the definite intuition that some kind of cardinal series was being engendered by doing it, and so we continued to do it to see where it would go. That there was a cardinality to it. And the other, which was non-intuitive, but was empirical, because we were checking ourselves. Reality checks of checking ourselves, checking each other, checking the other person. We found that not only was there a cardinal sequence that intuitively seemed to be happening, but that there was an ordinal ordering that seemed at the very same time to be implicit. The cardinal ordering was explicit, the ordinal ordering was implicit. The cardinal ordering was a sequence of intuitiveness, whereas the ordinal was a kind of a realization that a certain well-ordered form was unfolding. And that both these were happening at the same time. And this, in fact, is exactly what happens when the most profound mathematicians on this planet look at numbers. It is impossible to separate those two together. When you look at number in the most profound kind of way, an example, Hermann Weil's The Continuum, a critical examination of the foundation of analysis, written during the close of the First World War, published in Berlin in 1918. Weil looks at number, and he writes in his preface something which is not only logically sound, mathematically apt, but one can hear in retrospect from 1994 the uneasy reverberations of the German psyche at the end of the First World War, setting them up like setting ducks for the Nazis. So it's of interest in a lot of different dimensions. His preface, an investigation of the continuum, the examination of the foundation of analysis. What is number? What is it when number stacks up in a cardinal way, and what is it when number is looked at formally as an ordinal ordering? What are we talking about? What are we looking at? What do we find? He writes in his preface, "It is not the purpose of this work to cover the, quote, firm rock on which the house of analysis is founded with a fake wooden structure of formalism." The, quote, firm rock of the house of analysis, what the human mind can understand about analyzing. Not to cover that with some kind of a bullshit wooden superstructure. Excuse the Hollywood inflection. But these problems caused a lot of deaths in this century, and we need to hear this in a serious manner so we don't make the same mistakes again. Because the United States is exactly in the same position that Germany was in 1917 when this was written. And there isn't any America outside of America to stop a Nazi manifestation here. We'll win. We have to stop it. And part of this education is to make sure that there's no 21st century American right. It is Weil writes, November 1917, in Berlin. "It is not the purpose of this work to cover the firm rock on which the house of analysis is founded with a fake wooden structure of formalism, a structure which can fool the reader and ultimately the author into believing that it is the true foundation." Nicely covered words, beautiful airtight arguments that then are supposed to be stronger than the rock which is supposedly underneath them. He writes, Weil writes, "Rather I shall show that this house is to a large degree built on sand. That it's not a flimsy wooden structure built over a firm rock, but that in fact what we thought was a firm rock is actually sand, and it doesn't matter what kind of house you build on it. You can build it out of wood, you can build it out of supersonic polished wood, you can build it out of concrete and steel. It's still built on sand. What the hell's going on?" He writes, "I believe I can replace this shifting foundation with pillars of enduring strength. They will not, however, support everything which today is generally considered to be securely grounded. I give up the rest since I see no other possibility. At the center of my reflection stands the conceptual problem posed by the continuum, by the movement, by the motion, by the yangness, which always occurs with the yin. The way in which things happen, the way in which what happens, the way in which existence occurs. Because following nature, we took a look at ritual. Why? Why did we take a look at ritual? Because ritual occurred both in a cardinal and an ordinal manner. Because we didn't assume that nature was a firm rock at all. It was a well-informed education. We made no such supposition that nature is there and therefore we can count on it as a place where we can begin and then build from that. Not at all. We began with very consciously understanding that nature is a zero-based mystery. And we can't paint it pink. We can't paint it even black. We can't even paint it white. We can't even paint it multicolored because there's nothing to paint. There is no paint, there's no brush to paint, and there's no one to paint it. And there's no one to check up to see whether any of this was not true. We're talking about zero. Let's give it that Oakland ghetto inflection. Zero, man. The big tilde. That somehow zero base origin works. We don't know why. That it does work, that we know. How do we know? Because we do it. And that ritual follows nature in a cardinal way, because ritual has to do with objective existence. While nature does not exist, whatever we do does. Even though what we do, in some cardinal intuitive way, seems to be based on nature, in an ordinal empiricality, we know that it really isn't, and yet we still see that what we do works, and so we continue with the rituals. And we're seeing that our ancestors, our distant ancestors, not just like great-great-grandpa, but that the species that preceded Homo sapiens, even as early as Homo habilis, some 5 million years ago, already had an eerie sense. They had no idea of causal cardinality, and yet they still used the beginnings of tools and implements, and rituals began in that way. That rituals have nothing to do with superstition. They have nothing to do with primitive beginnings that were dark, evil, stupid, but that there was this uncanny appreciation that you can do, and it happens. Even the solipsism of later 20th century anthropological investigation of the chimpanzees that use the little twig to get the ants out of the anthill. Oh, look, they're tool making. It's a kind of a shaggy metaphor, because the origins of our species several orders ago are remarkably different from chimpanzees of the 1970s. The similarity is fortuitous in that our ancestors 5 million years ago, first beginning to do, proceeded along even though they didn't understand any kind of causality. And they proceeded in spite of the intuition that it probably wouldn't go anywhere. It comes down to us today in the first indications that all of awareness are an ironical uneasiness. Which shows up in a preference for negativity. The negativity is a left-handed, obverse confidence, saying no when you know that yes is happening. It's like the stage of childhood where the little child begins to really form a very good sense of personal identity, and the first thing that they do is they say no to the person they have the most confidence in. Usually the mother or the father, one or the other. I don't like you, no. And it goes on for days, goes on sometimes for weeks, and after a while it evaporates. What happened to it? The no, the negativity, was a manifestation of the zero-based mystery which was factored into the personality via the most accurate love relationality available to the child. That's what happened. And a real education brings this out in a very large way. We have to understand that even though we're afraid, we still love. And that's why the mystery is real. And it has everything to do with the fact that numbers are real. They're existentially very real. But whether the number sets are real is a problematical issue. Weil writes here at the very center of my reflection on the continuum, on numbers. The very center of my reflections stands the conceptual problem posed by the continuum, a problem which ought to bear the name of Pythagoras, and which we currently attempt to solve by means of the arithmetical theory of irrational numbers. And then he goes on with this, and towards the end comes to this kind of conclusion. Here we break off the development of our subject. This is the very end of the paper. We read the first paragraph of the preface, now the last paragraph of the whole work. Here we break off the development of our subject. We have seen that a version of analysis can certainly be constructed from our principles, and we have carried out the initial stages of this construction, as far as we thought necessary to grasp the Pythagorean problem fully. To the criticism that the intuition of the continuum in no way contains those logical principles on which we must rely for the exact definition of the concept real number. Let's read that again, because this is very difficult. This is the pairedness of the dead cat and the live cat at the same time, of the 0 and the 1 at the same time, of Thoreau and the I Ching at the same time. He's saying he went through as rigorous as he could, and Herman Weil at his best was as rigorous as you can get. He said you can call it Pythagorean yang if you want to. The fact is indelible that the intuition that there is a continuum in no way contains those logical principles on which we must rely for the exact definition of the concept real number. We respond that the conceptual world of mathematics is so foreign to what the intuitive continuum presents to us that the demand for coincidence between the two must be dismissed as absurd. Whoa, wait a minute. The reality which the mind can objectify and prove to itself has no relation whatsoever to the intuitive, presentational, objective reality that's there in existence. Well, you're saying that the mind's objectivity, which is formally precise to a degree that one finds startling. We'll come after the break to Roger Penrose, The Emperor's New Mind, where he says that 100 years before Euclid showed the mathematics of Euclidean space and so forth that comes out of spatial relationality as a physical certainty. Plato, 100 years before Euclid, showed that the intellect has a certainty much more radically true than physical certainty. We think empirically that physical certainty is a real certainty, but the intellect's certainty is a much more deeper certainty, while some 2,200 years after Plato, after Euclid, saying that in his analysis he found that it's absurd to even maintain the fiction that there's any coincidence between them whatsoever. Nevertheless, those abstract schemata supplied to us by mathematics must underlie the exact science of domains of objects in which continua play a role. Even though it's absurd to maintain that they have anything to do with each other, the mathematical certainties must somehow underlie the domain of physical objectiveness. Why? Because the ongoing actuality keeps it ongoing inactual, which is a paradox. It's a paradox. It's an absolute paradox. Well, what is it that we're experiencing here? We're experiencing that when you take a look at existence precisely, it really happens. If I do something objectively, it has really objectively happened. There's no way that that has not happened. But the relationship of what happens objectively in any ritual way, the relationship of that to the mystery of nature is at best only a probable relationality. And far from bothering us, this gives us a hint, this gives us a clue. If I use the logical form A equals A, I have the rock bottom, the firm rock of the formulation of identity, the whole principle of identity. A equals A. Yeah. So that A over A equals 1, right? Yes. That's the whole basis. A over A equals 1. 1 over 1 equals 1. But the only way to get A over A equals 1 is to take one of the A's from A equals A and bring it over to the other side. In which case, A over A equals 0. Because that's the real fundamental truth upon which every equation is written. Otherwise, it would not hold. So not only does A over A equals 0 as the basic state, the zero base, the origin of that, but A over A equals 1. You're saying 1 equals 0? Yes. The cat is both alive and both dead, and to not know this is to live in a reductive fantasy, which is very dangerous in the 1930s of the 20th century, and is even more dangerous in the America of the 2020s and the 21st century, unless we teach the reality of personalities which can accept this. This kind of education is not in the living rooms of people in 20 years. Then some kind of party ideology will be. Let's take a break. In the 1932 preface to the Continuum by Hermann Weyl, just 6 months before the National Socialists took over Germany, a more calmed down Hermann Weyl wrote, "The point of view adopted in this monograph continues to strike me as a natural transitional stage in the development of foundational research. However, in the period since its appearance, my work has been superseded by two trends identified by catchwords, intuitionalism and formalism. Still, this deeper grounding of the foundation has not led to an even moderately satisfying or defensible conclusion. Things remain in a state of flux. It seems not to be out of the question that the limitations prescribed in the present treatise, in other words, unrestricted application of the concepts existence and universality to the natural numbers, but not to sequences of natural numbers, can again be of fundamental significance. In other words, we need to really be circumspect when we talk about existence and universality. Even on the very profound level of mathematical logic, deep into the 20th century, we have to understand that when we talk about existence and we talk about universality, we can use those words. We can talk that talk about objectiveness, like numbers, like the natural numbers. But we have to hush ourselves and be wise as serpents and not talk about existence, not talk about universality in the sequences of natural numbers. What has that got to do with stopping fascist ideologies from taking over human populations? It has everything to do with it. Everything. And not to understand this is proof in itself of the bankruptcy of the whole educational system. Because even more important than teaching people how to get jobs is teaching people how not to dice up other human beings en masse by sets of exclusion. And before anybody works, we need to understand this. That's the kind of education that's going on. And it's not in the universities because there's no place for it to be in existing schools. Because if I'm right, then we pull the plug and we get something that works. It's interesting in a way. Princeton University Press in 1952 published Herman Weill's book on symmetry. Weil had done a lot of work with the development of the nuclear bomb. On page 26 of Symmetry, where he's talking about the poignant necessity of trying to understand what we call pairedness here. That asymmetrically quality form is not at all an impairment. One understands pairedness so that individuality occurs in a loving way with a specific purpose, even unique purpose, which cannot be excluded from the values of a true universe. That is to say, even though something may happen only once uniquely, like this person, that person has a right to existence and a right to be included in the universality of actual realness. And that the old categorical imperatives of Immanuel Kant saying before anybody does anything we have to ask what if everybody did this, and that leads directly to fascist ideologies by people who don't easily control powerful philosophical concepts, and can be challenged directly eye to eye by the existential imperative that asks the exact opposite question. What if nobody did this? The universe may be minus this value. And though it's unique and only this person, they have a right to existence. Now, we don't usually bring sociological issues and political repercussions to the fore in this education. But you don't have to think very far, 1 or 2 steps from what's being said every week, to see that this pushes against a lot of situations. And this is hidden away here in the center of Los Angeles because there's a lot of organizations that don't want to talk this kind of talk at all. Because it's a direct eye-to-eye challenge on centers of power that are big and entrenched. While, incidentally, points out that one of the most useful asymmetrical forms is the human heart. It is well known that the heart of mammals has an asymmetrical screw. It gives a little diagram here. So there are a lot of intelligent, interesting, informed people who've gone through a lot of travail to get you here. Don't blow it by thinking that there's something else to do. There's nothing else to do. If this doesn't get done, there's a lot of sand going to wash a lot away before we're gone. So that ritual, when we're talking about ritual, we're not talking about an academic subject. We're not talking about primitive superstitions. That we make masks of food and of feeling is a primordial preparedness which needs to be experienced. But before it can be experienced, it needs to be extant. It needs to exist. So we haven't talked about experience at all. We haven't even brought language into play. We haven't brought the whole realm of myth into play yet. That's coming up next. We're going to spend 3 months on it. We haven't even done that. And beyond that, we would get to symbols in the mind, ideas. We haven't even done that. And then there's a whole year of differential considerations that, man, we've pared it down to just the essentials. Nothing but plain fare. No fancies. But it'll take another 1.5 years just to look at the bones that we have to consider and the blood vessels that we have to consider and the capillary actions about digestion and reality. And you can do whatever you want with the education. I'm just delivering it. You do what you want with it. But action is objectively real, even though it does not have a direct causal relationship to nature, whatever nature is. It doesn't need a causal relationship. It only needs to have that resonant, vibratory preparedness to be real. When the Blackfoot tribe does their sun dance, their oka, the men's warrior society, the Itskinaye, when they come out with their curved staffs that look for all the world like prelate croziers from the Vatican and have nothing to do with it, but have to do with the energy of the buffaloes, semen, long poles of this kind of masculine power of the buffalo. And the rattles that they have are the dried scrotums with the testes of the buffalo. When that sound comes out, the rest of the tribe clears out of the way. Because the Itzkinai in that portion of the Sundance is bringing naked male power out, and if it's misunderstood, misused, it turns to violence. And so the Itzkinai always arranges themselves by fours. Always by fours, never more. And they do their ceremonial dance to bring that procreative masculine power of the buffalo into the Sundance society. And everyone clears out of the way. And it's only later on in the day, in a whole other society, the women's society, that the women come out by fours. And they purify the space of the four directions, doing every action 4 times, not in some kind of superstitious, stupid, primitive way, but in a very measured way, because these are women who understand life. They're purifying the space of the world that has harbored this naked energy of the Itzkinai. So that later on, in the evening, the men and women dance together with their arms around each other's shoulders, and the whole tribe is one great big circle, because they understand that they can be together in a mellow, natural way. And that ritual is so real that nature responds to it out of pairedness, not out of causality. Because if you think it's out of causality, you get into the black magic of trying to force nature to respond. And you can end up slapping the face of Mother Nature and thinking that you're going to get something from her. But more than likely, it's some human being and not Mother Nature at all. And the only thing you're going to get is their death. Don't do it. A little understanding goes a long way. We don't have tribes anymore. We don't have mature councils anymore. Nobody knows anymore what things are for. Why? We need an education. What does ritual do? It generates culture. The pattern of the actions of the people makes the fabric of the culture. And the culture, when it flames into expression, delivers the myths. So traditional culture generates myths. And that pattern of action and those myths establish the conventions of experience. And people who share conventions of experience identify each other as being the same people. The Blackfeet do not call themselves Blackfeet, they call themselves Siksika. We move the same way, in the same direction together, so that all of our moccasins are darkened by moving to and fro on the earth in the same way, in the same direction. We constitute a point in Hilbert space. Though they couldn't talk about it that way, that's what they meant. And so when any one of us sacrifices in the sun dance, the whole tribe is purified. The traditional culture, generating myth, sustains conventions of experience, And this is the foundation upon which styles of perception occur, and the way in which existence gives the flavor of experience. And we know from 150 years of anthropology that the ways of doing this are legion. There are many ways to be human in this way. And the validity of some culture over here does not invalidate the validity of some culture over here. The Tiwi at the interface of Australia and Indonesia are Tiwi, and they have nothing to do with Mayans. They have nothing to do with the Ashanti. But they're very good Tiwi. They would be very bad Tiwi if they were 1% Ashanti or 1% Mayan. Because as soon as you dilute, as soon as you crack a cultural fabric, as soon as you tear it, the whole culture comes unraveled eventually, inevitably, because it was all of a piece. And when the fabric of culture tears, the conventions of experience are doubted, and the whole style of perception is invalidated. And the program to do this in a concerted way is exactly what fascist ideology is all about. Only our culture is going to survive. And our culture is superior because it's based on ideology. This is flawed 6 ways to Sunday, to use an old phrase. But there has to be a way to understand that and a way to pass that on to hundreds of millions of people, not just to an intellectual here or there. Doesn't mean a thing. If some patent clerk in an office in Switzerland understands relativity and can express it, that's not enough. So existence, what can we say? We can say that existence as the surface of nature frequently functions as a mirror. And in the good old days of Euclid, one could say that that surface was a plane. But it doesn't take very much to make the refinement to understand that planes are very rare except in the mind. And very often, in fact all the time, what one finds in nature are curves. And you have to deal with the forms of solids. And if you deal just on an intellectual level, on an ideological level, you come up with 5 Pythagorean solids. And it's very, very difficult, once you're convinced in that mode, to be able to backtrack and deal with the ritual purity of doing, which allows for a language to come out cleanly, as we might say. And all kinds of scramblings happened in the old Hellenistic times that were very similar to the scramblings happening in the 19th and 20th centuries in political philosophy. All kinds of parallels. That one can't choose the intellect over the physical world, or choose the physical world over the intellect, they have to be dealt with as a pair. And that the objectiveness of ritual doing has to be paired with the objectiveness of symbolic understanding. Because symbols are just as objectively real as ritual actions that are done. But that they have to be dealt with together as a pair. Otherwise, the integration process becomes truncated, becomes diseased, and it leads to the kind of sick aberrations being megaphoned out by satellite programming for generations without anybody even being able to catch it up. Because nobody's natural enough anymore to just be natural, and nobody's smart enough anymore just to be intellectual, and nobody is heartful enough to be able to put the two of them together relentlessly enough to resolve it. So the next dark age could last for at least 10,000 years. Let's not do it. Let's get educated. If we talk about existence as the surface of nature, functioning as a mirror, then we can carry the metaphor of saying that this allows for images. Why are there images? Because existence as a surface of nature, we don't know what nature is, but we know that it has surface. And the surface is what we do. And very often that's curved. So that when we want fullness to our surfaces in ritual, we tend to make them circular. Not circular as in dead-end ruttedness, but circular in the sense of completeness. So if you take the culture, a culture, of a people who identify themselves, we are this people, and you put all of their ritual actions together in a single matrix, you will come out with a ritual year. Every time. It's amazing. Every time. So that the wheel of the ritual year is the objective calibration of what existence is for them. And they use that ritual year to tease out of the mystery of nature an annual cycle of nature, which fits with the cycle of the ritual year. It's not the other way around. Because when it's the other way around, one is looking at nature as objectively as you can to make sure that your ritual year fits there. But we know when we look at human societies on this planet, all of them, that they pay attention to the detail of the ritual, not to change the ritual at all, because they know that what they're doing is evoking a response out of the mystery of nature. And the natural cycle is going to follow the response as a response to the ritual cycle. And that's why the dogged determination to keep rituals pure in all human cultures. Because there's a lot of mystery in nature. We don't know all that's there. No one knows. But we know if we do this right and keep this pure, what comes out of nature will be affine with it. And with these two wheels, the chariot of the king can roll. What is the joint? What are the joints by which this ritual activity works the actions? What are the responses from nature? The images. The movements of the dance evoke from nature the images that go with them. And where do those images register? They register in the language. Not in the mind first, they register in the language. It has to go through a whole transformation before it registers in the mind. They don't see anything. Here, they see it in nature. The visions are in nature. Because language itself is not objective. Language itself is like nature. It's a mystery. It's a matrix of change. Words don't register in language, they just are. When they're allowed to evolve, they eventually create a kind of a space in the mind, a mental space, which is in no way simple Euclidean space. It's not even simple Hamiltonian space. It's not even simple Hilbertian space. It's very complex. Very complex. No one knows how to write the mathematics for mental space yet, but we're getting closer to understanding that we didn't know, and that's important. The mind's space has nothing to do with the brain's function. Just like you can have existence of cardinal numbers, but don't call the existence of concepts of existence and universality can be applied to natural numbers, but not to sequences of natural numbers. Why? Because the sequences are all culturally relative. Why are they culturally relative? They're culturally relative because that's how they happen. That's how they happen to be objective and real. And they have a vibratory pairedness with the existentially real numbers. But there's no way that they're cause. So that one has to be very circumspect and say, the images which the language registers in nature are paired with the efficacy of the actions which we do, but neither causes each other. And if you look closely enough, they're not connected at all. Which is why primordial man had to have some kind of a guarantee that the mystery was going to be operative in their life, because they knew there wasn't any causality, and that's why there was no notion of causality at all. On tribal level, nobody believed in causality. No one talked about that. Not because they were stupid or primitive, but because they were not stupid and because they were not primitive. They knew that you had to bring God into the equation. Otherwise, it's not going to work. We set up the conditions so that there is a vibratory responsiveness. Nature will respond to what we're doing, but not because of what we're doing. We're offering what we're doing, and the divine will see to it that it works, that what we do has a response from nature, that the images will fit the actions. So that life is a gift, and not collecting the bill of our authority. You can't write out a bill to reality and say, I've done this, pay me, give me life. That's stupid. And yet every educational program that's on the planet now assumes that. It's an error. And there's no human population that would have survived on that basis. And this one won't survive either on that basis. So we have to get smart again. Not cute, but we have to get smart again and be able to go back and understand why human beings always respected the mystery of the divine as an indispensable resolving field within which what we do jibes with the images from nature of what is done, and that they come together. Revolutionary here. So images could be said to well up from the matrix of change. They well up from nature. To be seen, which is perception, and said, which is the word, and eventually interiorized as ideas, which are the symbols. And in this ecology, language mediates images into ideas. And ideas are a higher order, a set, which has a specific, precise function. What does the set of ideas do with images? They integrate them. And they integrate them according to levels of meaning which are finite and exact. Why are they finite? They are finite because that's the way it happens. The very first philosophy of physics, De Rerum Natura of Lucretius, you can translate the title, The Way Things Work. We don't know specifically, precisely, no one does, why. But that it does can be proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's no question whatsoever. This is exactly what happens and what works. As to the ultimate why is just truly mysterious. So that the structure of language, we will find out when we look at myth, the structure of language is very peculiar. The structure of language, from a symbolic standpoint, is the logic of the sets. And in our time, a very, very great mathematician whose book has just absolutely disappeared. Where is Cantor's book on sets? Here it is. Cantorian set theory and limitation of size. We have to bring in Georg Cantor. This book, Cantor's Theory of Number, Chapter 3, just to get an idea that the complexities of the 20th century are truly complex. And no one's going to go into the 21st century without at least being able to understand where we are. And this is really where we are. In this chapter, I want to pay off some explanatory debts accumulated in Chapter 2. I stated there that Cantor's mathematical theory of cardinal number is as an interior theory with the number classes as the interior representatives of power. Oh, these mathematical books, when you read them politically, dynamite. Whoa! Cantor's mathematical theory of cardinal number is as an interior theory with the number classes as the interior representatives of power. Do you remember we were talking about counting, linearity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? We're talking about that. And we're talking about how that arithmetical progression, that arithmetical sequence, like baby steps, full of confidence and everything, but as soon as you get to counting by powers, 10, 100, 1,000, a million, a billion, the sequence, instead of being on a plane, rises asymptotically in a curve that achieves almost verticality, not quite. And as one lives in a universe where the arithmetic linearity and the set asymptotic verticality both have to be considered together, one starts to get the idea of the ordination of everything. And that you have to take not just the plane, but the verticality at the same time into play. And it turns out very quickly that there are actually 3 axes and not just 2 in this. And when that's put into motion, one gets all kinds of convolutions that are very, very, very peculiar. And that peculiarity more and more becomes recognizable. Didn't we see this before? Yeah, it's the mystery of nature. That our distant ancestors, not just great-great-grandfather, but species ago, our ancestors saw this same mystery. This is just the cultural style of perception of seeing the same mystery as they saw then that we're seeing now. What are we going to do? We need to understand that they survived, and they did well. They got whole jumps of order of capacity of beings here, us. What did they do that was so successful? They did activities in such a way that their activities patterned together and brought a pattern of response out of the mystery to pair up with what they did. And when they did that, when they created language to pair up with nature, the mystery of language and the mystery of nature, they found that they didn't just sandwich in and limit the ritual realm of doing, but they opened up a parallel realm to ritual doing, which was the interior realm of the mind. And God gave the gift of mind because people learned how to say things that evoke truth from the mystery of nature. That's big stuff. It's worth more than a footnote. It's worth at least a chapter. No? Let's come back here to chapter 3, a little book on Cantorian set theory and limitation of size. Oxford Logic Guides, number 10. A strange place to find these kinds of ideas, isn't it? But, writes the author, it is interesting to ask, what exactly are the numbers? How did Cantor think of numbers? We're not only asking what are numbers, which is in itself peculiar. All right, here's a fellow that dealt in a seminal way with powers of order. Set theory deals with powers of order, the geometricity of numbers. What for somebody who is masterful at thinking about the geometricity of numbers, what did he think the arithmetic cardinal numbers were? What did he start with? It's a very interesting question, because it gives us a hedge up. How are we to think of it? When you ask yourself, driving home on the freeway, and don't think about it too deeply until you get home, because those freeways will blank out. The mind is much stronger than the physical images of freeway systems. What are numbers? What were they for Cantor? It might be argued that although he developed the number class structure, it does not follow that he takes the various number classes to be themselves the powers or cardinal numbers of the infinite sets. Now you can count from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can do that into infinity. You can always add a cardinal number and keep counting. So one can say that for cardinal numbers, if you want to take them as a whole, as a set, it's an infinite set, because you can always be adding to them. The question is, what are those numbers? What were they for Cantor? He understood better than anyone up to his time. And very few people since then have improved on it. Believe me. He understood the sets of how you take powers of number and you deal with them logically, but he in no way made a misidentification which someone like a Nazi ideologue would make. That is to say, he takes the various number classes and does not follow through by thinking that they themselves are the powers or have the existence that cardinal numbers have. To do so would be to be buffaloed by your own mind games, which frequently happens today. I forget the comedian who said they not only think up these stupid things, but they believe them. They think up these stupid games, and then they turn around and they actually believe in their own stupid games as being real. Eric Byrne, games people play. As we have seen, there were difficulties with the number class theory, not least misunderstanding well-ordered. The ordinality is very important. The ordinality is always paired with the cardinality. And you have to take them together. Why do you have to take them together? Otherwise, a style of truncated misperception begins ritually to rule the way in which you talk, and the way in which you talk is a lie which interiorizes itself as an idea, as a symbol, which has nothing to do with the real, has everything to do only with what you need to believe, because that's how you said it, and that's what got responded to in nature, and because you proved to yourself that, well, this works for me, and just because it doesn't work for the other people, you can't just erase them and rub them out because they're in your way. So there's a little bit of seriousness here. Number classes. Number classes, Cantor had this little notation that he used. He used the Hebrew letter Aleph, and he put a subscript with the Aleph. And in order to distinguish the two elements that were absolutely essential in understanding what was real in terms of number, in terms of numbers, classes, in terms of sets, he put a subscription 0 with one Aleph and a subscription of 1. So that you had Aleph 0 and Aleph 1. It was almost like a Kabbalistic mystery play right before one of the world's greatest mathematicians, and he worked it out. And our author writes, as we have seen, there were difficulties with the number class theory, not the least well-ordered. But although these did not force Cantor to give up the theory, we can see clearly that he fully realized its potential and remained committed. And equally, the use of number classes as representatives of power does not force one to assume that they themselves are the numbers. Other possibilities are available. For example, it is quite possible to read Cantor as supporting the view that cardinal numbers are actually primitive, non-set objects. Numbers are actually, instead of primitive, we could use the term as we use here, primordial. Non-set objects. Numbers are actual objects. Where do they occur? Where is their existence? In the mind. So that what happens in the mind, if it is a pristine primordiality, if it occurs without the influence of ideological cookie cutters restructuring rituals so that it works in a non-natural way. If the whole ecology flows, what occurs in the mind is objectively real. Not a mental thing, but objectively real as any existence would ever be. This is exactly the point that Plato made 100 years before Euclid. More next week.